Elon Musk recently gave his strongest argument about the moon landing debate and whether it was real or fake, and this time he focused less on the footage and more on the silence that followed. So why did humanity achieve one of the greatest technological feats in history only to seemingly forget how to do it? Combine that with the shocking new inconsistencies that are surfacing, missing telemetry data, strange lighting artifacts, and unexplainable anomalies in NASA's own archives, and it is no wonder the controversy still burns. Some experts argue that the evidence of a hoax is growing, while others say these gaps are just the chaos of history. But today we will analyze the ultimate evidence that will end the debate on the moon landing and whether it was real or fake once and for all. And in this video we will expose one critical inconsistency that might flip your entire view on this debate. So in Elon Musk's sit down with the Babylon Bee, the host pivoted the conversation toward one of the most persistent conspiracy theories, whether the moon landing was real or fake. They pressed Musk with the direct question of whether he personally believed the United States actually landed astronauts on the lunar surface, or if the whole thing could have been staged. It was framed in the Bee's usual satirical tone, but the underlying question was one that millions of people still debate today. Musk didn't hedge. He laughed it off and replied with a firm dismissal of the hoax theory. His words were clear. "We went to the moon not once, but many times, and I think the Russians would have called us out on that one if it wasn't true." He emphasized that we definitely went to the moon. We went to the moon several times. We 100% were at the moon. In other contexts, he has doubled down on this view, even posting online, "It is insane how many people have asked me if the moon landings are fake. They are indeed obviously real." Now, taken together, Musk's answer on the Babylon Bee and his follow-up statements make it plain that he sees the idea of a faked Apollo program as nonsense, and his go-to argument is that America's Cold War rivals would never have allowed a fabrication to go unexposed. Since Musk, the man who has arguably become the face of modern space exploration, firmly believes in the validity of the initial moon landing in 1969, the question then becomes, what proof actually supports the certainty behind his stance? Well, the discovery of hydrated lunar minerals by China's Chang'e 5 mission in 2020 actually weakens the argument from moon landing deniers about the missing stars. Conspiracy theorists often claim that Apollo photos must have been faked because no stars are visible in the background. But Chang'e 5's mineralogical findings, especially hydrated compounds containing bound water, were only identifiable with high-precision instruments and careful sample return. These results confirm that the lunar surface was brightly illuminated by the sun, which reflected strongly off the gray dust and the white spacesuits. Cameras were set with short exposure times and narrow apertures to properly capture the brightly lit astronauts and equipment, which meant dimmer objects like stars simply didn't register on the film. In other words, the stars were there, but the camera settings made them invisible, just like how stars often don't show up in photos taken on Earth during the daytime. China's independent verification of surface chemistry and lighting condition makes the missing stars claim even less plausible. At the same time, these new discoveries underscore that true lunar science requires real presence and samples, not studio tricks. If Apollo had been filmed on Earth, there would have been no way to produce samples containing lunar unique minerals like change site Y or hydrated compounds that China has now confirmed. The fact that two different nations, separated by decades, both returned minerals with consistent evidence of solar exposure, volcanic timing, and volatile content reinforces the credibility of the moon landings. Rather than supporting skepticism, China's results independently validate the physical environment Apollo astronauts described, where the blazing reflection of the lunar surface drowns out the stars. One of the most important Chinese findings that pushes back against the American flag looking like it's rippling or waving, even though there is no air or wind on the moon. So to the human eye, it looks exactly like fabric moving in a breeze, which should not be possible in a vacuum. This makes people suspect the flag was filmed on Earth inside a studio where a draft or air movement caused it to move. NASA's explanation is that the flag wasn't waving because of wind, it was moving because of physics. The samples confirm not only extreme dryness, but also minerals altered by direct solar wind exposure, which only happens in a vacuum. This reinforces what NASA already explained. The Apollo flags weren't waving in air currents, they were jolted into motion by the astronauts twisting the pole into the lunar soil. In a vacuum, with no atmosphere to dampen motion, the fabric kept oscillating oscillating briefly, something entirely consistent with the way that materials behave on the moon. At the same time, China's high-definition images and far-side samples further emphasize how hostile and still the lunar environment is. The lack of any measurable atmosphere means there is simply no medium to create a wind. If there were, China would have seen erosion effects, weathering layers, or signs of ongoing particle movement. But instead, their studies point to billions of years of untouched volcanic basalt and solar particle implementation. The Apollo flag's appearance, creased fabric stretched by a horizontal support bar and vibrating briefly when disturbed, is exactly what one would expect in this environment. Rather than fueling skepticism, China's independent discoveries about vacuum conditions and surface chemistry actually strengthen the case that the Apollo missions took place on the moon. China's Chang'e 5 and Chang'e 6 sample returns also add serious weight against the Van Allen radiation belt conspiracy theory, the claim that astronauts could never have passed through the belts without dying. The lunar soil brought back by both missions shows unmistakable signatures of cosmic ray and solar wind exposure, implanted helium-3, isotopic shifts, and radiation-damaged minerals. These are the same kinds of radiation effects Apollo samples showed decades earlier. If China, using modern detectors in labs, found the same radiation fingerprints in their samples, that means the moon really does sit in a high-radiation environment beyond the Van Allen belts. It directly validates that human return samples from Apollo were authentic and not Earth rocks dressed up as props. At the same time, China's data reinforces why Apollo astronauts survived the journey. Exposure is real, but survivable with proper timing and shielding. NASA explains that the Van Allen radiation belts pose a risk mainly during long-term exposure. The Apollo missions avoided this by flying through the thinnest regions and crossing them in roughly an hour. Because the passage was so brief, astronauts received only a very small dose of radiation, about the equivalent of a chest X-ray, and in fact, less than the cumulative exposure that some airline pilots receive over time. The spacecraft's thin aluminum hull provided additional protection, and mission planning carefully avoided the highest radiation zones. According to NASA, the exposure levels were far below the threshold for harm, and radiation monitoring during and after the missions confirmed the astronauts received safe doses. So at the end of the day, the moon landing debate shows how one of humanity's greatest achievements has also become one of its most questioned events. For skeptics, details like missing stars, strange shadows, or the Van Allen belts fuel doubts that just won't die. But NASA and countless scientists argue that every claim has a clear explanation rooted in physics, photography, and mission records. So whether you believe it was the ultimate victory of science or the biggest hoax in history, one thing is certain. The moon landing continues to spark curiosity, controversy, and heated discussion more than 50 years later. And that is why people are still talking about it today.